The moment my daughter called me Thunderfoot across the Thanksgiving table, I felt my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt since she was 9 years old. Thunderfoot, that ridiculous name. It started when she was little, maybe 6 or 7, because I used to stomp around the house in my work boots before I'd changed out of them, and she thought it was the funniest thing in the world. She'd run ahead of me down the hallway yelling, "Thunderfoot is coming! Thunderfoot is coming!" until her mother told us both to settle down before the neighbors called. After a while it just stuck, the way those things do. And then she grew up, and middle school happened, and one day it just quietly stopped, the way a lot of things quietly stop when your kid stops being a kid. She hadn't used that name in over 15 years. I looked at her from across the turkey and the cranberry sauce and the green beans my wife had made from scratch, and my daughter, 31 years old, a woman with her own apartment and her own career and her own opinions about everything, was smiling at me like nothing was unusual. But something in her eyes was asking me to pay attention. Her boyfriend was sitting right next to her. His name was Nolan. She'd been dating him for about 4 months, and this was the first time she'd brought him to a family dinner. I'd been looking forward to it, honestly. My daughter doesn't bring people home easily. She's careful in the way that careful people are. Slowly, quietly, making sure before she commits to anything. So when she'd told us about him 2 months earlier, I'd figured he must be worth something. And when we met him, I understood why she'd said yes. Nolan was easy. That's the only word I have for it. He was easy to like. He had the kind of handshake that isn't too firm and isn't too weak. The kind that says, "I've thought about this." He asked about the house, complimented my wife's cooking twice without it sounding rehearsed, and he knew enough about college football to talk with my brother-in-law for 20 minutes without running out of things to say. He looked at my daughter like she was something he was still grateful to have found. My brother-in-law leaned over to me in the kitchen while we were getting more ice and said, "He's good. Where'd she find this one?" I laughed. I told him I didn't know, but yeah, he seemed good. And then my daughter said, "Thunderfoot." I'm not a dramatic man. I spent 30 years as a project manager for a construction firm outside of Columbus, which means I spent 30 years solving problems before they became disasters. You develop a sense for when something's off. It's not intuition, exactly. It's more like pattern recognition. You learn to notice when the load-bearing numbers don't add up, when the timeline's too clean, when someone's too confident about something they should be uncertain about. That was the feeling I had when I heard her say that name. I didn't react. I smiled back at her, passed the rolls to Nolan, asked him something about where he'd grown up. I think he said Indiana, somewhere outside of Fort Wayne, and I kept the conversation moving. But the back of my mind had gone very quiet in that particular way. It goes quiet when something needs my full attention. After dinner, my daughter offered to help clean up, which she always does. But while Nolan was in the living room watching the game with my brother-in-law, she came to stand beside me at the sink. We were both just washing dishes, and she said quietly, without looking at me, "I knew you'd notice." I didn't say anything right away. I handed her a rinsed plate and waited. "He asked me last week," she said, "how much I got from Grandpa's estate. My father-in-law had passed away 18 months ago. He'd been a methodical man, a retired engineer who'd spent 40 years saving carefully, and he'd left my daughter a meaningful inheritance. Not life-changing in the way lottery money is life-changing, but significant. Enough to buy property. Enough to matter. I kept washing. "What did you tell him?" She paused. I told him I wasn't sure of the exact amount, which is true, mostly. "Why did he ask?" She set down her dish towel and looked at me directly for the first time since we'd been at the sink. "He's been talking to me about an investment opportunity. For about 3 weeks now. He says one of his college friends runs a private equity fund out of Charlotte, and they're opening it to a small group of outside investors. He says the minimum is $40,000, but he's trying to get me in at $25 because of, me and him." I turned off the water. She kept going. "He has all these documents. A prospectus, financial statements, charts. It looks professional. He said the fund has returned 19% annually for the past 4 years. I dried my hands and looked at her. "Did you sign anything?" "No." "Did you wire anything?" "No." "Did you wire anything?" "No." He was pushing for an answer by the end of the month. I took a breath. Okay. She looked at me with something that was trying very hard not to be fear. "Dad, is it real? Could it be real?" I told her I didn't know yet. I told her not to give him any answer until we'd had a chance to talk more. I asked her to send me everything he'd given her, every document, every email, every text if she had them, without telling him she was doing it. She nodded. She went back to the living room. I stood at the sink for another minute just looking out the window at the backyard, at the oak tree we'd planted when she was born, and I thought about what I knew and what I didn't know and what I needed to find out. By the time I was sitting at my desk that night after everyone had gone home, I had 11 documents in my email and a yellow legal pad next to my keyboard. The fund was called Keystone Apex Capital. The prospectus was slick, well-designed, professional fonts, the right logos in the right places. It listed a registered address in Charlotte, North Carolina. It named a managing director, a man called Brennan Forsyth, who had, according to the bio included, spent 12 years at a mid-size regional bank before founding the fund in 2020. I spent an hour with it. A 19% annual return, sustained over 4 years, in a private equity vehicle. That's not impossible. It's not common, but it's not impossible. The thing about fraud is it has to be believable or it doesn't work. The documents were believable. They had the texture of real financial documents. Most people would have looked at them and felt the way you feel when you're handed something official, a little intimidated, a little deferential, a little inclined to trust the expertise of whoever put it together. I'm not a financial expert, but I've spent a career reading contracts and project documentation, and I know what it feels like when language is designed to impress rather than inform. There were paragraphs in that prospectus that said a great deal without saying anything specific. The performance data was referenced but not sourced. The fund's auditor was listed as a firm I'd never heard of. I started writing things down. In the morning, I called my college roommate who had spent the last 25 years as a CPA in Cincinnati. His name is Larry. Not a complicated man, not a flashy man, but the kind of man who has spent his whole career looking at numbers honestly, which makes him exactly the kind of person you want when you're trying to figure out if something is wrong. I sent him the documents. He called me back 2 hours later. "Where did your daughter get this?" he said. I told him. He was quiet for a second. "The auditor they list, Halloran Certified Partners. I can't find them. I checked the AICPA member directory. I checked the Ohio CPA Society even though they're claiming Charlotte. Nothing. There's no registered firm by that name. So it's fake. The auditor is fake. That doesn't automatically make the whole fund fake, but that's a significant red flag. A real private equity fund doesn't use a ghost auditor. It doesn't work that way." I thanked him and hung up. Then I looked up Brennan Forsyth. There was a LinkedIn profile. It matched the bio and the prospectus almost word for word, which is either because the prospectus was copied from the LinkedIn or the LinkedIn was built to validate the prospectus, and at this point I was fairly certain which direction that had gone. The profile had been created 14 months ago. It had 63 connections. There were no posts, no endorsements, no activity. The profile photo showed a man in his 40s in a blue blazer, photographed slightly off-center the way stock photos sometimes are. I ran the image through a reverse image search. It came back as a Getty Images stock photo. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The man who had given my daughter these documents, who had sat at my Thanksgiving table and shaken my hand and asked about my house, he'd handed her a portfolio built around a fictional auditor and a stolen photograph of a fake managing director. And he'd timed the pressure for an answer to arrive before the end of November. I pulled out my legal pad and thought about what I had and what I still needed. I'm going to tell you something about this part that I think people don't expect. The hardest conversation wasn't with my daughter. The hardest conversation was the one I had with myself, alone, at about 11 o'clock that night, when I had to decide how far I wanted to take this. My daughter was not engaged to this man. She hadn't given him money. She hadn't signed anything. The practical answer, the easy answer, was to tell her the fund was fraudulent, end the relationship, move on. That would have protected her. It would have cost him nothing. And somewhere else, he'd do this again. I called my daughter the next morning and asked her to meet me for coffee. Not at the house. Somewhere neutral. A diner we'd been going to since she was in high school. She came in looking like she hadn't slept much either. I told her what I'd found. I walked her through it. The auditor, the image search, the LinkedIn profile, the timeline. I set my legal pad on the table between us and went through it like I was walking a client through a project review. She sat across from me and didn't say anything until I was done. Then she said, "He was so good at it." I told her that was the point. She looked at the window. "How many other women has he done this to?" I told her I didn't know, but that I wanted to find out and that I needed her help to do it. What I asked her to do was not nothing. I want to be clear about that. I asked her to continue the conversation with him, not to agree to anything, not to give him information, just to keep the door open long enough for me to find out if there were other victims, and to give us time to put together a proper report. She would have been completely justified in saying no and just walking away. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "What do you need from me?" It took 10 days. My daughter kept her responses to him brief and vague. She was still thinking. She had some questions about the minimum timeline. She was talking to her financial advisor. Nolan was patient in a practiced way that I recognized, because impatience would have spooked her, and he knew that. Meanwhile, I filed a complaint with the SEC's Office of Investor Education and Advocacy. I filed a separate report with the North Carolina Secretary of State's Securities Division, because that was where the fund claimed to be based. I found a consumer fraud attorney through a referral from my brother-in-law's firm, and she spent 45 minutes on the phone with me and told me we had enough to support a formal investigation and that she'd seen this pattern before: the romantic setup, the inheritance target, the fake institutional documentation. They find women who've recently come into money, she said. Divorce settlements, inheritances, life insurance payouts. They move fast enough to seem legitimate but slow enough to seem sincere. She asked me to send her everything I had. The attorney also told me something that I think about whenever I'm tempted to feel good about how this ended. In most cases like this, they don't find them. The people who run these operations are experienced at disappearing. The fund is a shell. The name is an alias. The address in Charlotte comes back to a mailbox rental facility. By the time anyone official starts looking, there's nothing to find. I don't know what happened to Nolan after the reports were filed. I don't know if that was even his real name. I know that my daughter blocked him on everything the day after I submitted the last report, and I know that he sent her one text from a number she didn't recognize, just 3 words, "wasn't ready yet," which told me that the only thing that had protected her was timing. She hadn't been ready enough, the Thunderfoot thing. I asked her about it later, maybe a week after everything had settled. We were driving back from picking up a few things she needed for her apartment, just the 2 of us, and I finally said, "When did you come up with that?" She laughed a little. Not a completely happy laugh, but real. "I didn't plan it exactly. The week before Thanksgiving, after he first asked about Grandpa's money, something felt different. Like the temperature in the room changed. And I kept thinking, I don't have any way to tell you that something's wrong without him noticing. I couldn't text you because what if he saw it? I couldn't pull you aside because he'd ask why." She looked out the passenger window. "I remembered when I was little and you used to say that if I was ever somewhere I felt unsafe, I could call you and say our code phrase and you'd come get me, no questions asked. You told me that when I started going to middle school sleepovers, we never actually had to use it. But I remembered that you'd said it, and I thought he doesn't know anything about Thunderfoot. That name exists in a world before him. So if I say it, you'll notice, and he won't know why." I didn't say anything for a second. "Did you know I'd figure it out?" I asked. She smiled. "No. I hoped. You're pretty good at figuring things out. I've been thinking about that drive for weeks now, about how much weight was sitting in a single word, and how she'd carried it through an entire Thanksgiving dinner with a man she was beginning to understand was not who he said he was, about how she hadn't panicked and hadn't confronted him and hadn't done anything that would have tipped him off. She'd held it, and she'd found the one channel she had that he couldn't intercept. She's her grandfather's granddaughter. That's what I kept thinking. He was a methodical man. So is she. I want to say something directly before I finish because I think it matters. What happened to my daughter is not rare. The specific shape of it changes. Sometimes it's a dating app. Sometimes it's a friend of a friend. Sometimes it's someone in a professional network. But the underlying structure is the same. Somebody identifies a target. They identify what the target has. They build a relationship specifically calibrated to lower that target's defenses, and then they ask, "The thing that protected my daughter wasn't that she was smarter than the people this happens to. It wasn't that she was suspicious by nature. She liked this man. She thought he was real. What protected her was two things. First, she hadn't yet given him the answer he was building toward. Second, she had a way to reach someone she trusted without alerting him that she was reaching out." The practical things I'd say to anyone listening: if someone you're in a romantic relationship with asks detailed questions about your assets, an inheritance, a settlement, savings, before you've been together long enough to be making financial decisions together, that's worth pausing on. It doesn't mean they're lying, but it means the question is worth asking. Why do you need to know the exact number? If someone presents you with an investment opportunity and applies a deadline, slow down. Urgency is a mechanism. Legitimate investments do not expire in 3 weeks. If you want to verify an investment fund, the SEC's EDGAR system is free and public. If the fund isn't there and isn't exempt and can't explain why, you have your answer. And if you have people in your life you trust, a parent, a sibling, a friend who thinks clearly, let them look at the documents before you sign anything. Not because you can't handle it, but because a second set of eyes from outside the relationship will see what your feelings make it harder for you to see. My daughter didn't lose anything except 4 months, and some feelings she's still sorting out. I think she'll be okay. She already is, mostly. The last thing she said to me before she got out of the car that day, "Dad, can we maybe come up with a new code word? One that's a little less embarrassing?" I told her we absolutely could. She's still workshopping it. She hasn't told me what she's landed on, which I think means she's still holding it somewhere safe, just in case she needs it. That's my girl. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, trying to figure out what it actually means. Not the fraud part. That part I understand. People do terrible things for money, and they've been doing it since long before any of us were born. What I keep turning over is the smaller thing. The thing my daughter did at that dinner table. She didn't panic. She didn't confront him. She didn't pull me aside and whisper something that would have tipped him off or put her in a worse position. She thought it through, found the one channel available to her, and used it. At 31 years old, in a situation that would have rattled most people, she kept her composure and made a smart decision under pressure. I don't think that happens by accident. I think it's the result of years of quiet accumulation, of watching how problems get handled, of learning that the right response to fear isn't always the loudest one, of understanding that there's a difference between reacting and thinking. I can't take credit for teaching her all of that. Most of it she figured out herself. But I do think the environment matters. What children watch us do when things go wrong tends to stay with them in ways that nothing we say ever quite matches. What Nolan was counting on, what people like him are always counting on, is that the relationship will do the work of lowering someone's guard. And it works, more often than it doesn't, because we're built to trust the people we care about. That's not weakness. That's how human beings are supposed to function. The cruelty of what he was doing is that he was using something good, her willingness to trust, her openness to a new relationship, as the mechanism for harm. What stopped it wasn't suspicion. My daughter liked him. She thought he was real. What stopped it was that she had the presence of mind, even while liking him, to notice when something shifted, and then she had the courage to do something about it, even before she knew for certain what she was dealing with. She didn't wait for proof. She reached out. I think about the people who don't have that, who don't have someone to call, or who feel too embarrassed to say something, or who've been in the relationship long enough that the idea of being wrong seems worse than the possibility that something's right. And I think the most honest thing I can say is, get someone else to look at it. Not because you can't handle it yourself, but because the people closest to us are also the people we want to see clearly, and those two things are very hard to do at the same time. My daughter is going to be fine. She already is. She lost 4 months and some feelings she's still working through, and she came out the other side with her savings intact and her instincts sharper than before. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. The word she used to reach me, that ridiculous, embarrassing, perfect word, is still sitting somewhere between us doing its job. Whatever she replaces it with, I hope she never has to use it. But I'm glad it exists. I'm glad she remembered we'd agreed on it. And I'm glad she trusted that I'd be paying attention. I was. I always will be. That's the whole job.